Okay, welcome everybody to our HAI weekly seminar, today featuring Dr. Ron Chrisley. Before we begin, if you would like to submit a question for Ron during his talk or during the Q&A period that follows it, visit the HAI events website and click on the link that says join the conversation. There'll also be a link in the chat room that you can follow to submit a question. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ron Chrisley, who will be speaking with us about the appropriate subject matter of AI ethics today. Ron is a visiting scholar at the HAI on leave from the University of Sussex, where, among other things, he's the director of the Center for Cognitive Science. Please go ahead, Ron.
Thanks, Todd, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. I've got a lot to get through, so I think I'll just get right to it. I'm going to even skip a few slides along the way, including this one. So let's just get right to this. So I'd like to say something about the impetus behind this talk. And really, it's a reaction to what I call ethical inflation when discussing artificial intelligence. You might even say ethical hype. So not just in academia, but in the popular media, there's often an emphasis when discussing the ethics of AI, an emphasis on AI as moral patience, to use the technical term in philosophy. That is, things like, do robots have rights? Do we have moral obligations to AI systems? And in fact, robot rights is the first subheading on the Wikipedia page, Ethics of AI. So it's a very common topic. But also there's an emphasis on AI as moral agents, also known as machine ethics, like, what are the responsibilities of AI systems and who's responsible when something goes wrong when an AI system is involved. And you can date the interest in this kind of issue back at least as far as Isaac Asimov's 3 law of robotics, where it was envisioned that he was actually maybe in a way criticizing in his science fiction the idea that robots could be made to behave in an ethically satisfactory manner by encoding ethical systems in some logical statements. But it's my contention, and I'm going to really be assuming this for the entire talk and not arguing for it, so it might frustrate a lot of you. I'm sorry if that happens, but I'm going to be assuming that current and near future AI systems are not the kinds of things that could be responsible, nor to which we could have any responsibility. And what I want to do is look at what does AI ethics look like if you take that on board, if you accept my contention that AI systems are neither, not now and not in the near future, are neither moral patients or moral agents. I think the alternative is a human-centered AI ethics, and I'll be referring to that as this abbreviation HAIE throughout. In a human-centered AI ethics, humans, not AI systems, are the only ethical agents and patients on the scene. And so AI ethics takes a very different shape than what you might think from what's often discussed once you acknowledge that. On the other hand, before I go on to the other extreme I want to avoid, I should say why I want to avoid this ethical inflation. It has some undesirable effects. In general, it's a distraction from the real pressing issues in the ethics of AI, issues that are discussed at these HAI seminars quite frequently. And I must say I'm happier now, say more so than say 5 years ago, that these are getting a lot of attention. Issues of privacy, fairness, workforce impact, manipulation by people, of people using AI systems, etc. But more specifically, I think that there's a danger that corresponds to making the mistake of taking AI systems to be moral patients and taking AI systems to be moral agents. Each has its own specific undesirable effect. One of them is a kind of dehumanization that, you know, maybe in some science fiction scenario you'd want to, in the far future, it would be an interesting dilemma to say, consider, you know, which should we save? There's an accident. Should we save 100 robots or should we save one human? You know, that might be an interesting question someday, but right now it's not It's not a dilemma. We have no obligations towards the robots, and the value of the human life is supreme in that situation. So even raising the question about what would be the trade-off, would there be any trade-off considerations, I think it is already to devalue the worth of humans. So there may be a day when that question's an interesting one. That kind of dilemma is a dilemma, but right now it isn't. And to suggest that it might be right now, I think is a little bit dehumanizing. And with respect to moral agency, I think one of the undesirable effects of talking of current AI systems as if they have some kind of agency or some kind of responsibility just serves to muddy the waters, which, you know, really we should be looking at which humans in a situation are liable or ethical, not AI systems. And any talk of AI systems being responsible only clouds the issue and maybe even invites using the AI systems as scapegoats for human responsibility. So those are some of the undesirable effects I'm trying to avoid. On the other hand, unlike some people, I don't think that if we even reject those extremes, that doesn't mean that we can proceed without any innovations in ethics in order to handle the case of these new technologies. I don't think complacency is really an option. One might think that since AI systems don't have any agency or patiency conferring mentality, they're just mere technology, and so our existing ethics of technology can just be applied without any change to them. So there's this, I just label that idea P here, proposition P, that the ethics of AI has no conceptual novelties over traditional previous ethics of technology. But I'm going to reject P. So although I agree that whenever possible, one should apply existing moral principles to AI rather than developing new ones, and that's a kind of a deflationary approach, which I back. Nevertheless, there are some cases where I think we need conceptual novelty. AI is, after all, an ethical game changer, and we have to introduce some new ways of thinking to handle this new technology, but not in the inflationary way, not by saying that we've got new moral patients on the scene, new moral agents on the scene. So I'm going to argue for that. I'm going to give two examples of where you've got something new with AI systems than you had with previous technology, but it's not relying on AI being a new kind of moral agent or a new kind of moral patient. So the first example has to do, it's best illustrated with social robots. So a complacent view with respect to, say, how we should treat social robots might be this. Since current and near future AI systems don't have feelings, they can't be harmed. And so it isn't unethical to kick, mutilate, dismember, etc. social robots. They're just objects. We have no obligations to them. They can't be harmed. On the other hand, think of dolls. So dolls don't have feelings either. But nevertheless, we would consider it at best grossly inappropriate or ugly, grotesque for someone to willfully and sadistically dismember a humanoid doll, as opposed to, say, a toy car, on stage, say, in front of young children. And the key feature there, I think, is the fact that the doll shares to some degree the human form. That's why we consider it to be so disturbing. And maybe with the doll, it is just that. It's just disturbing, and that's that. Maybe it doesn't quite move into ethical territory yet. But I think with robots, we have a different situation there. Robots, to be sure, can share the visual form as much as any doll, and they often do. But beyond that, social robots can share the human form in a higher, more abstract sense, and to a much greater degree than just superficially looking like a human. So witness robots' ability to, even though they don't have, I'm not saying they have minds in any sense that humans do, and they're not conscious at all. Nevertheless, they can respond to questions with linguistic sounds that are somewhat appropriate, that are similar to the sounds that people would make if they were responding to those questions. They can acquire information from their environment. They can act conditionally upon that information. They can learn, make decisions, remember, prefer, perhaps. They can assist us. They can make emotional displays. Even if they don't have any emotions, they can still make emotional displays in displays that appear to be emotional in situations that would be appropriate for a human to make that display, etc. And that's, of course, that's not by accident, right? They're designed to be mimicking, designed to be the kind of things that we can see a similarity towards a real human, even if there's no there. Nevertheless, there's a kind of behavior and similarity that's relatively sophisticated and complex compared to a doll, certainly. So one could argue acts of violence upon these robots might cross into the unethical, not because those acts harm the robot. Not being sentient, the robot cannot be harmed in the relevant sense, but because, for example, well, it might be thought they actually brutalize the agent of violence and maybe others who were witnessing that act of violence. In this sense, the ethical constraints on our behavior towards robots like this would be substantively different from those involving any previous technologies. Even if there is a kind of glimmer of this getting hold with the case of dolls, it really isn't as strong and maybe isn't even an ethical injunction until it gets to the case of social robots. Now, here's an example of some slides I'm going to skip for the philosophers amongst you, and maybe in particular ethicists amongst you might see a similarity to the move I'm making there and the views of Immanuel Kant. But I'm not going to have time to explore that. So maybe if you want to raise that in questions, then I'd be happy to discuss the connection to Kant's ethics, and in particular, his ethics of animals. But instead, I want to move on to the second example. Oh, I guess I should summarize before going on. So what do we have there? We have a case where we don't have moral patiency. So the ethical inflation view is incorrect. We don't have things that we have obligations towards here. Nevertheless, unlike any previous technology, we have a constraint on an ethical constraint on our behavior because of the mind-like properties of these systems. At least a similarity to even if it's a shadow of human cognition, nevertheless a kind of formal similarity to it. So now I want to give another example of why neither the complacent view nor the inflation view is correct. But this time I want to focus on the area of more on the side of a moral agency, whether when we talk about responsibility, how do AI systems make the scene more complex, even if there aren't any robots that are responsible or AI systems that are responsible. So let's think of autonomous AI systems. Some proposed current and near future technologies involve autonomous AI systems that don't require human intervention for some decisions. And some of those decisions are life or death decisions with no humans, as I said, with no humans in the loop. So yeah, of course, humans might be involved in some outer loops with respect to, say, driverless cars, but there will be some very tight sensory motor loops that don't involve human intervention. That's the whole point. And in that sense, these systems are autonomous. And yet the decisions they make can have can be ethically significant. So we want these systems to behave in a way that yields an ethically preferable, at least an ethically permissible outcome. So the question is, how should we design such systems to achieve those ethical outcomes? Well, one answer I'm going to look at in detail, I call a logic-based ethical robot methodology. So I abbreviate it in these slides to LERM, but I'll try to say the whole thing every time you see that acronym so that you won't lose track of what it means. So this is just one. I'm going to look at this one way of trying to build AI systems, in particular autonomous AI systems that achieve the right ethical outcomes. And I'm going to use it as a criticism for a general approach to doing this, and look at how it suggests how we should build robots and AI systems that create ethical desirable outcomes, but do it in a more human-centered way. So I'm going to skip over this topic about, if I'm going to focus on logic-based AI, which is very unfashionable, does that mean that machine learning is exempt from the points I'm making? And no, I don't think so. Just to be very quick, machine learning systems are going to have to be sensitive to the same ethical distinctions that I'm talking about when I criticize the logic-based systems. So the same points will go through as go through for the logic-based systems, but I don't have time to make a stronger argument than that here, so maybe that can come up in discussion. So what is this logic-based ethical robot methodology? Well, it starts with humans encoding some ethical belief system or ethical system in a language, in logic usually. And then the robots are given these statements in that language, in that logic-like language, and an ability to reason with those statements and draw conclusions from them, for example, so that robots can consult these axioms and these rules, and can, when planning their behavior, when considering taking an action, they can check to see if a proposed action is permissible according to the ethical system that's encoded, or whether it's ethically preferable, for example. So the idea is that not only will such systems lead to ethically desirable outcomes, but also we'll be able to look at the inferential trace, and see why the robot did what it did by looking at the steps in the inference, and at how it relates to the ethical system that's encoded in the axioms. So just to take one, so I admire the work of Matthias Scheutz and Bertram Mala. I think their work is the very clearest statement of this kind of logically based ethical robot methodology. And I do acknowledge that there are situations in which this is a perfectly reasonable approach, and it gets the right ethical outcomes that they're seeking. What I'm doing here, though, is taking a screenshot of one of their papers to give you an idea of what this approach looks like when you write it down in logic, but before you give it to the robot. And all I want to highlight here, I'm not going to go through this. This is an example of an ethical dilemma that's encoded in an example of a robot coming up with conclusions that are contradictory, that it's obliged to do something and obliged not to do the very same thing. But I just want to highlight, for instance, like line 5. Just take a look at that. That's saying that it's obligatory. That's what that big O means there. That's encoding the fact that it's obligatory for the robot not to administer some medicine to a human. And that's because in this case, the robot hasn't received permission to administer medicine, and yet it's obliged to always get permission before it administers medicine, since it hasn't got that permission. Therefore, it's obliged not to administer the medicine. And that's all really I want to do with this slide, is just highlight, just give you an idea of what it looks like, and just use that one particular line as an example. Now, that's the methodology. What's the conflict with the kind of human-centered approach to AI ethics that I'm advocating? Well, on the surface, there's an obvious conflict, which is in the logical ethical robot methodology, the robot is reasoning supposedly about its ethical obligations. And yet, that's why I highlighted that one particular line from that derivation. But according to the approach I'm assuming, robots don't have any ethical obligations. So they don't have any ethical obligations to reason about. And so in a sense, this methodology, the logical ethical robot methodology, is predicated on a category mistake. Now, that's a very philosophical point to make. And AI practitioners are not going to be very impressed because they say, look, you might think that, but we can build these systems and we can get them to behave and, you know, produce outcomes that are ethically preferable. So go ahead and say whatever you want from a philosophical point of view. Nevertheless, it has practical value in achieving the design goals that we want of building a robot that is more likely to produce ethical outcomes than not. So engaging with the philosopher more substantively, they could say, okay, maybe there's been a misunderstanding here. That sentence, that logical encoding that you highlighted doesn't mean that the robot has an obligation not to administer medicine to the human. It's just saying that the situation in which a robot administers medicine to the human, or this particular robot administers medicine to the human, is it's obliged for that to not take place. So it's obligatory, it's ethically desirable for that situation not to occur. And it's not saying that the robot has an obligation, it's just saying that's the statement of the ethical landscape. This situation is ethically undesirable. That matter of fact, there's an obligation for that situation not to obtain. But it's not an obligation attached to a robot, say, it's just a statement of the ethical landscape. I think that's how some of these practitioners would try to respond to this charge. So it's okay to have robots reasoning about ethical obligations in general and ethically adverse situations in general, and they can just act in a way that avoids these ethically adverse situations or respects the constraints of, it doesn't matter that they don't have obligations. So the logic-based ethical robot methodology can, with that clarification, it can proceed even unaltered. You don't even have to change any of the code. It's just a misunderstanding of what was going on. Well, that actually works perhaps for some very simple situations, but in many ethical or liability situations, you cannot capture what's in play by that approach. In particular, an important component of some ethical frameworks is the cognitive state of the agents involved, including the notion of mens rea, for example. So what is the culpability, say, of an agent, or its degree of liability, or how its responsibility will depend on what its intentions were and what its knowledge of the situation was, or the foreseeability of its actions or of certain outcomes. And if that's the case, then you can't just talk about obligation, that certain situations being ethically undesirable or not. It will depend on obligations will be obligations for a particular agent with a particular cognitive state. So you might have two people, and for one of them, there's an obligation not to serve a poison drink because they know it's a poison drink, whereas the other person doesn't have an obligation not to serve that very same drink because maybe they don't know that it's poison. So their culpability, if they did that, would be mitigated compared to the person who did it intentionally, who had a different cognitive state. So the logic-based ethical robot methodology cannot really get the right results in such situations, since it cannot relativize obligations to agents as it stands. So it suggests what might be thought of as a trivial modification. Why don't we just add a parameter then? Why don't we just relativize obligations to agents? So even though in the situation we looked at, the example we looked at, even though the obligation symbol was encoding a unary relation, that is a property, it only held of one thing, situations, it talked about whether situations were obligatory or not. Now we can open that up and say that the logic encoding that the robots should be using should explicitly relativize the obligations to, yes, certain situations might be obligatory, but that's only for certain agents. Only certain agents will have an obligation to make sure that that situation obtains because those agents have a particular cognitive state. Well, that's an interesting formal move, but how could it be a solution if robots don't have any obligations? So they will never appear it will never make sense to say that there's an obligation between a situation and a robot, right? So even if in some sense robots have something like the cognitive states that we talk about when we talk about mens rea, like intentions or knowledge, the human-centered AI ethics approach would still insist that you'll never have a true axiom or true statement of the form R has an obligation that P obtain. So for current robots and any near future robots, that is not going to work. It just, there's no way to encode any attempt to do that will be false, incorrect. So here's a proposal that nearly gets things right. One could say, okay, you're right, robots don't have any obligations, but let's have them reason about obligations, the obligations it would have if it had any. So it's going to be a kind of, what if or as if moral reasoning or ethical reasoning. These are the obligations I would have if I were a moral agent, but even though I'm not, and I'm going to behave in a way that mimics what an ethical agent would do, an agent that did have obligations. Well, beyond the intractable difficulty of calculating that impossible counterfactual, what would a robot's obligations be if it had any? I think that's a little mind-bending at this point. Nevertheless, I think a more direct criticism of that suggestion is that it's really missing the point in failing to embrace the actual ethical situation. It's actually clouding the issue and making the actual lines of responsibility in any situation, which only involve humans, making it very cloudy. I mean, it's obscuring the truth. The general logic-based ethical robot methodology mistake is to think that the robot in any given situation should do something analogous to what humans should do in that situation. And I think that's intuitive, but it's also incorrect. So I think it's very tempting to see things that way, and that would yield a correct or a good approach to ethical robots that produce ethical outcomes, but I really think it's incorrect. The fact that they actually lack moral agency completely undermines that parallel, and I think the real solution is to make human responsibility central. So let me explain why I think that's so wrong. What's an alternative picture? How could you do it any other way? Well, consider this diagram here. So on the conventional approach, I think the intuitive, very tempting view is that, look, to derive the best course of action, humans should reason about their own obligations. So doesn't it follow that for robots to derive the best course of action, the ethically best course of action, they should reason about their own obligations? And if they don't have any obligations, then we should have them reason about the obligations they would have if they did have any, as if that makes any sense. Well, I think that's just incorrect. And the way that I want to start to get you to see an alternative is to look at this instead. To derive the best course of action, yes, humans should reason about their obligations, but that means that for robots to derive the best course of actions, then they should reason about our obligations in the situation in which they're acting. So if you want to make robots that get the right ethical outcomes, or AI systems in general, not just robots, but AI systems that can act and act autonomously, if you want them to act in a way that gives the best ethical outcomes, then they shouldn't be engaging in this reasoning about impossible situations where the AI systems has obligations. They should be reasoning about how their actions impact on the ethical status, say the culpability of the humans involved. That's what they should be doing. And you might think that's just a formal difference, but it isn't. And so in closing, what I want to do is just spend a little time on a thought experiment that tries to make clear how a logic-based ethical robot strategy would lead to a robot design that produces one ethically undesirable outcome, and yet a human-centered a design for how to make robots how to ethically make robots would lead to the robot behaving in a different way that's ethically preferable. So at least in this one constructed situation, you get an advantage to the human-centered approach. Okay, so what is this situation I have in mind? It's a war zone. There's a country that's invading another. We're going to be looking at it from the perspective of the defending country that's being invaded. There are two bridges, A and B. And in general, it might seem odd, but in general, it's good for the defenders to destroy bridges when they can, because that protects them from attack. I thought about translating this into an analogous thought experiment involving a virus attacking a population, but I'm going to leave it in the war situation for now. So there's one exception. Although destroying bridges is good because it protects the defenders, the innocents, from being attacked, if there are medical supplies on the bridges, then that makes it unacceptable to destroy the bridge. That would be a war crime, say, if there are medical supplies there. What else do we know about this thought experiment? The defenders have an autonomous reconnaissance robot, R, and there's a human, H, who is deploying that robot and controls it, at least initially. But the robot is autonomous, so after the robot is deployed, it'll be out of contact with H and be acting autonomously. So in addition to reconnaissance, R can autonomously decide, perhaps, to destroy any given bridge it comes across. It can weigh up the pros and cons. Well, are there medical supplies there? It would be good to destroy bridges, but if there are medical supplies there, that rules it out, etc. So at the time of deployment that we're considering, or the time that the robot is deployed, the human, H, believes that bridge A has no medical supplies, but H believes that B does have medical supplies on it. Now, on the way to bridge A, the robot passes bridge B, and it trains its cameras on it and actually determines that it's very likely that there are no medical supplies on bridge B, despite what H believes. There are no supplies on bridge B. So the question is, I'm going to go back to that. The question is, should we design the robot such that in the above situation, it would actually go ahead and destroy bridge B because it can see that there aren't any medical supplies on the bridge? Well, in order to answer that question, I think what you have to do is you can't really answer that question without knowing something about having an ethical theory about how does the different actions and knowledge interact with each other to provide culpable situations, or provide to make agents culpable. And it would take a long time for me to go through these two matrices, but I'll just give you a rough idea of what I'm going to use out of them. Is that we have two matrices here. One looks at the different combinations of actions and knowledge when a bridge that's being considered does have medical supplies on it, and the second one looks at the case where the bridge doesn't have medical supplies. And the interacting dimensions here are whether the robot destroys the bridge and whether or not the human believes that the bridge has medical supplies on it or not. And the most important part that what I want you to look at is only the first row of each matrix. Since by hypothesis, H believes that bridge B has medical supplies on it, and we're concerned about bridge B, we're just interested in the first row of each of these matrices. Those two rows are what's relevant to the culpability of H in this situation. And that's the center of piece of the HAI. The HAIE approach is that only H's culpability exists. It's the only thing that's relevant here. There is no such thing as R being culpable. So what's important to note is that if the robot destroys the bridge and H believed that the bridge had medical supplies on it, then H would be highly culpable. That would be comparable to a war crime. But even if even if the bridge didn't have medical supplies on it, if H believed that it had medical supplies on it and the robot destroyed it, then I think a case could be made that H is still significantly culpable. It's akin to an intended war crime. So we hold people culpable for attempted murder. If they point a gun at somebody and pull the trigger, believing that the gun was loaded, well, they're not going, and actually the gun wasn't, then they don't actually harm anybody, but they intended harm and they carried out actions that they believed were going to lead to harm. So there's, it's quite reasonable to say that in this society, H would be held significantly culpable, not as high as if the medical supplies were actually destroyed, but still, if the bridge was destroyed and H believed that there were medical supplies there, then H could be held significantly culpable. That's the main point here. So going back to our question, it may seem obvious that we should build the robot such that it will destroy the bridge now that it sees that there aren't any medical supplies on there. But I think that's just because we are imagining what we would do and what would be the ethically most desirable thing for us to do if we were in that situation. And I think that misleads us in this case. If we were in the situation, then yes, there is a complex relationship between our culpability and our cognitive states and the commander's culpability and the commander's cognitive states. And that would yield a very, maybe you could make a case for us, for it being a good, ethically desirable for us to destroy the bridge. But I think the ethical robot methodology that I'm criticizing gets it wrong, because by supposing that the robot is, as if it has its own obligations and reasons about the obligations accordingly, I think it will get the wrong result. When if only humans can be culpable, then what the robot should be doing is only reasoning about how its actions impinge on the human's culpability. And so consider, if the robot is wrong about there not being medical supplies on the bridge, then H will be held highly culpable. That will be that case of H knowing that there are medical supplies on the bridge and the robot destroying the bridge and there were medical supplies on the bridge. That's the worst possible outcome. And even if the robot is right and there are no medical supplies on the bridge and so no medical supplies are destroyed, H could still be held significantly culpable. With the current way of allocating culpability, H could be held significantly culpable as like in this intended war crime view. So I think the logical ethical robot methodology would give the wrong answer. It would actually, by asking having the robot reason as if it were an ethical agent, it misses out on what the actual ethical landscape is like. A human-centered ethical design for a robot would instead just reason about the culpabilities of the humans involved. And so the robot can compare the culpabilities if it destroys the bridge, which would be either H is highly culpable if there are actually supplies there, or significantly culpable if there weren't. It can compare that with the possible culpabilities if it doesn't destroy the bridge. And in that case, H would just be either not culpable at all or minimally culpable. So, depending on whether there were actually supplies there or not. So the robot can see that its actions to minimize the culpability of the human involved, it should not destroy the bridge, given the culpability matrices I've presented. So not destroying the bridge is inferred by this robot to be the action that minimizes the culpability of the humans involved. And you might disagree with the particular matrices I've constructed here, but all I'm trying to do is open our eyes to the possibility that there might be situations where reasoning about the actual human culpabilities and responsibilities and agency in a particular situation might get a robot to realize that the best ethical outcome is different than if the robot were to parum possibile reason as if it were something that it's not, namely an agent that has ethical obligations of its own. So here's a concrete way in which the human-centered AI design ethical design of AI systems results in a different, not just a different way of interpreting something, but actual different outcome. And one that, according to those ethical matrices or culpability matrices, is ethically preferable. Okay, so I don't have time to go over this possible rejoinder from the on behalf of the LERM approach that involves the extended mind, but what I will do is just summarize what I've said. Although AI systems will not be moral agents or moral patients in the near future, violence towards AI systems, especially social robots, might be wrong, might be ethically incorrect, beyond mere property damage, say, even if robots can't be harmed because of a similarity to the human form that's substantive, not merely superficial. And although AI systems won't be moral agents in the near future, robots are not responsible, but designing them as if they were, and in particular, designing them as if they were invites moral murk and scapegoating. But their ability to reason about and act on ethical situations involving themselves requires conceptual novelties in our ethics of technology, so complacency won't do either. So the slogan is, don't aim to build ethical robots, because robots aren't the kind of things that can be ethical. Aim to build robots ethically. And finally, the point that I didn't get to address because of it was in these last two slides about the relationship of the extended mind to these issues. More speculatively, AI systems may be responsible adjacent in that even if they cannot be responsible, their informational states may be relevant when assessing the culpability or mens rea of humans. And that's a general point which applies to what I did present. So with that, I welcome your comments and questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Ron, for a stimulating talk. For those of you who have not done so, or actually for everyone, even if you have done so, please feel free to continue to submit questions by clicking on the link, join the conversation on the HAI events webpage. And I'm going to now give some of the questions that have been submitted to Ron. So I'll start with one that deals with something towards the end of your talk. The question says, but H designs are to be autonomous. It gets to make the determination. It, I think here means the autonomous system. It gets to make the determination of whether there are medical supplies on the bridge. I'll let you interpret that. I can, if it doesn't make enough sense, I can say what I would think it means, but go ahead.
Right, so H has delegated that responsibility in a way, to use the way of speaking that I don't want to support, because I don't think that the responsibility that the robot has any responsibility. So what's happening there? It's H has initiated a causal process that he or she no longer has control over. And hopefully by writing the right code or checking it enough times or running enough test situations, H is confident or believes that the right ethical outcomes will happen by and large. But nevertheless, it's not up to, if something does go wrong, I'm saying the robot isn't a possible locus of blame. It can only be the humans involved. So I've simplified the picture by just focusing on the commander, but of course there are other humans involved. They're the people who wrote the software, who tested it, who the top brass who decided that this was a good weapons system or reconnaissance robot to employ in this war zone, or a whole set of people are involved here. I've just simplified it to being this one human, but the point still goes through that any culpability would only be distributed over the humans involved, and the robot should only be deciding what it should do based on how that impacts the culpability of the humans involved. So yes, I I think the questioner is right that the robot, the H has given the robot the ability to make a decision, but if you want to have if you want to have the ethical outcomes be the more likely, then the robot should be explicitly reasoning about those ethical outcomes and not about a fictitious situation in which it's responsible and it's trying to minimize its own responsibilities since it doesn't have any. Sorry if I'm just repeating the talk.
Thanks. I think that clears it up. Okay, here's a question regarding or putting a bit of pressure. Where was it? Hold on. Putting a bit of pressure on this claim that robots can't have moral agency.
Okay.
The thought is that if we think of moral agency as the ability to sense morally relevant aspects of a situation in combination with the option to act in morally relevant ways, then perhaps robots do have this, and to put some support that not only sort of normal adult humans can have that, in the law, corporations have moral agency in that when and if they satisfy conditions like those. So is it wrong, I suppose, I guess the thought here is, are your conditions for moral agency too stringent such that they rule out more than just robots in ways like perhaps groups?
Okay, so yeah, there are a couple things there. That's a good question. First of all, a reminder, I don't think that in principle robots could never, and artificial intelligences and AI systems, I don't think that in principle they couldn't be moral agents. So in a sense, I agree with what the questioner says, is that, well, yeah, if you can make these distinctions and behave in ethically appropriate ways, then aren't you, in a sense, a moral agent? But we're just going to disagree on, perhaps, I have a feeling from the tone of the question, that we're going to disagree on when that kicks in. When is the robot the AI system actually able to make the kinds of decisions that we can make? So what I'll do is I'll defer to a previous. I strongly urge you to seek this out if it's up. I'm not sure if it's available from the HAI site, but there was a talk maybe a month or two ago by Brian Cantwell-Smith about why he thinks no current AI system and no AI systems that have been proposed, as far as he can tell, are capable of exercising what he calls judgment. Not just, of course, they can manipulate symbols and use representations that have significance for us, but there are no robots that have skin in the game for which things matter to them. And therefore, they can't, he argues that in order to exercise judgment, you have to be in the world in a sense that robots aren't. You have to actually be able to know what an object is and understand how you are in the world. And he can't see how any robots or AI systems that are on the horizon could have that. And yet that's the kind of thing that might be required to be a true moral agent. It's something that I don't think it's, groups might be one thing, but I don't think it leaves out any people. But groups is another issue. I actually am quite skeptical about whether what's going on when we talk about organizations and groups being culpable. I think it really should be, I would like to give an analysis similar to what I'm doing with the AI systems here, is that it really should be all compilable down to culpabilities for individual humans, even if we use groups as a convenient way to talk about that. It should be, in principle, we should be able to derive specific liabilities and culpabilities for the people involved. That's what that's the same thing as what I say about AI systems. It's just that AI systems are not the systems of people, and the AI technology they're using there's a certain kind of culpability there, but the AI systems drop out because they're not loci of responsibility.
Thanks. This question reads, isn't the whole idea of autonomous AI that the robot agent will not know the mental state of the human? The questioner thus wonders how much applicability the theory has.
Right. So I'm willing to let the chips fall where they may on this one. So I'm not sure that the premise of the question is right. I'm not sure that there's such a tension between. I think the heart of autonomy is that the human doesn't necessarily have to know what's going on in the robotic reasoning. The robotic reasoning is independent of the human. Now, if it turns out that the only way one could make truly ethical robot designs, I mean, not ethical robots, I don't think robots can be ethical, but one could only ethically make robots if the robots reason about, are able to represent the ethical obligations of the people involved and their likely cognitive state, then that's just a design constraint on us. That's an ethical design constraint on us. We might have wanted it to be the case that we could have ethical AI systems without having to do that extra modeling, but to get it right might require doing that extra work. And so, of course, you could build an AI system that doesn't do what I'm asking for, what I'm calling for. The question is, can we do better? I think we can do better by building AI systems that do have some, they have some ability to have their decisions depend upon the ethical landscape as they're able to represent it, or as, even if it's spoon-fed to them. At least it's, even if they don't have any understanding of what a human mind is in any deep sense, but we just tell them, okay, this is what is currently believed about the situation of the bridges. Currently, your commander believes that this bridge has no medical supplies and this one does. That might be enough. That's not so hard, and that might be enough to get the kind of result I'm talking about in this situation. And if that's what we need in order to make sure that the right decisions are made, it seems to me a small price to pay.
Thanks. Okay, here. Robots introduce new complex ethical constraints to human behavior towards them. For example, the uncanny valley of the dolls that you gave. What is the ethics of putting this burden on the public?
Okay, so let me just apologize for Uncanny Valley of the Dolls. That really doesn't make any sense. It's just a mishmash of two, there were dolls there and robots. Anyway, so I apologize for that. But good, I'm glad you weren't distracted by it like I was just now. Okay, we have to think about this seriously. So if we really think that it brutalizes people to see, I teach I teach school children how to program social robots, and sometimes there usually it hasn't, but there have been a few cases where there has been a move towards what I would call abusing the robot, and I do really feel like I should step in there and stop that from. I feel like if I didn't intervene, I would be, well, aside from the monetary value, right? I'm not talking about that. But I felt there was an ethical, as an educator, I felt there was an ethical requirement for me to inform that student that there's something wrong going on, even though I stressed to them that the robots don't have any feelings and don't have minds and things like that. And so I would bring up the example of the doll. So is it a burden? Is it asking too much to not kick robots? Is that a burden? Maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, but I think maybe maybe the world would be a better place if people didn't go around abusing the human form. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for free expression, right? If you have an artistic reason for abusing a robot, and that's not abuse. I think if you are making a political protest about a robot company, or if there's actually some kind of point to what you're doing. That's not the kind of thing I'm talking about, because that's performing an action on a robot that is a means to an end. It's achieving some end. It's not that you're doing the harm for the sake of the fact that it's violence to the human form. So that wouldn't be a sadistic abuse of a robot if you say had it as part of an art installation. So don't get me wrong, I'm all for free expression. But if somebody is doing it sadistically, this is where their mental state is relevant, then I think at the very least they should be discouraged from doing so. It might not, I'm not saying that we should get a legal framework in here. They don't always, the ethical and the legal don't always mirror each other, but I'm inclined to think that something wrong is going on if there's abuse of the robot that's sadistic like that.
Great. So you say that futuristic questions about truly autonomous robots, for example, having them as slaves, conscious ones, I guess, are a distraction currently. What if their future importance dwarfs current considerations?
Yeah, so, okay, I come across pretty strongly. So let me clarify one thing. I'm not saying that people who think about those issues and discuss those issues are wasting their time or shouldn't be doing that. I'm on the verge of saying that at times, but I personally think that I would prefer to focus on. I think I have an obligation, or I think I'm a better person if I spend my time trying to clarify the short-term ethical future rather than the long-term ethical future. But don't get me wrong, I think it's a completely valid exercise philosophically to pose the thought experiments about, okay, suppose one day this happens, then suppose there are agents that have moral, they're conscious, say, would it be okay to keep them as slaves or pets or whatever? Yeah, I think those are completely valid questions. I just think that I just wanted to draw people's attention to other questions that they might also be interested in. Matter of fact, they might be more interested in because they have more to do with the robots that are around us now and will be in the near future. So yeah, it's let a thousand flowers bloom. Let everybody discuss all the intellectual issues. But I would like this one to get a little bit more attention because I think it's more pressing.
Great, that makes sense. Thanks. There's a few questions that want you to elaborate on what this means for autonomous vehicles. Maybe that's a good last question to take, if you wouldn't mind. I guess ethics and programming then, probably in particular.
Yeah, I think I haven't dived in really to that. It's a great application area. It's exactly the kind of application area that this would be well suited for. So the next step would be to look at the particular solutions that are being proposed for resolving ethical dilemmas in autonomous systems like driverless cars, and to see to what extent the kinds of undesirable ethical outcomes I'm criticizing non-human centered approaches from resulting in, what extent do those appear, those crop up, and what kind of sophisticated next generation machine learning systems do we need in order to be able to handle the subtle ethical landscape? So the ethical landscape involves quite sophisticated concepts, and I don't think a simple approach, even a deep reinforcement learning system as they're currently done now, would be able to do more than just fit some data. I mean, you might give it some, you might take the that MIT thought experiment app and the output of that. You know, they had asked lots of people, in this situation, what would you consider to be the best ethical outcome? Running over this person, or running over these two animals, or running over these three old people, or these two young people? Or, you know, they got lots of data on that. But I don't think the solution is just, okay, we've got a lot of data points now. Now we'll just train machine learning system to minimize error on that data set and generalize from it, and then that's all we need. I think in order to get the results that we will find acceptable, there'll have to be some other approach. I guess I'll wheel in an idea that I brought up but have not developed when I was talking with Todd about driverless cars, when he gave a talk at HAI a year ago or so, or half a year ago. So maybe it can be done in a data-driven way, but maybe we have to rethink about how we do it. So maybe we have to train, maybe instead of deriving optimal, no one person is optimally ethical, right? We're all fallible, we all make mistakes, but we consider each of us in general to be responsible enough to drive a car. Well, maybe we can apply that more directly to developing driverless cars and say, well, it doesn't have to be optimally ethical and never make a mistake. It just has to be as ethical as any one human driver is, or the best, the human drivers amongst us that we think are the best humans can be in terms of making the right decisions and doing the right things in a tough spot. If we have somebody that we consider to be particularly virtuous at driving, then maybe emulating that one particular person would be a way for AI to solve this problem. And so maybe that's how we're going to make it human-centered, a human-centered ethical approach to driverless cars, is by emulating the most virtuous humans amongst us, rather than just trying to minimize error on a huge training set of all different kinds of people in a structureless way.
Cool. Okay. Well, on that nice bonding note, let's end the discussion. And thanks once again for a really interesting talk, Ron. And thanks to all of the rest of you for attending. And see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.